Alright, so Unit 2 is going to be on federalism, which is the U.S. government power structure. So let me go ahead and make this big, present. Alright. So we're going to talk first about the power structures. These three you have already known. You should have known these for your last Unit 1 test. We have a unitary system of government, which power is centralized in one central government, for example, Great Britain. There's also the federal system of government, known as federalism, which we'll talk about today, where power is divided between a central government and several state/local governments. And then finally, you have a confederate, it says confederate system of government, where power is primarily vested in individual states, bound together by a weak central government. And the example that we talked about in the last unit was the Articles of Confederation. Why did the founders establish a federal system? The main reason that they wanted to establish a federal system of government was to avoid tyranny. Remember, I told you that word tyranny. If you think of the word tyrant, tyrant is somebody who abuses their power. You almost may think of someone who is not doing the right thing. They're abusing their power. They could be taking advantage of people. They could be taking money, things like that. So tyranny is not good. Tyranny is also overstepping of their power, abuse of power. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to avoid that by dividing power between multiple levels of government. They figured out that the Confederation did not work. The central government was way too weak. You saw the example of that in Shays' Rebellion. So one of the clauses that the framers wrote into the Constitution is known as the Supremacy Clause, and you will need to know this for your test. The Supremacy Clause declares the Constitution, all federal laws, treaties, etc., as being the supreme law of the land. The states, all 50 states, they cannot pass laws that conflict with or nullify federal law. Okay? And if you nullify something, it's like you're going against it. So they cannot pass laws that conflict with any federal laws. Otherwise, they're going to have, it may go to the Supreme Court. Here's the power hierarchy. You should have this in your notes, so you don't have to write this. First, you have the Constitution. I told you that is like our contract. It's what lays out the framework of how we run our government. It talks about what the government can do, what it cannot do, and it also discusses the rights of the people. Next, underneath that, you have federal laws and treaties, and these are things passed by the federal government. Underneath that, you've got your state constitutions, and then underneath that, state laws, and then you have your local level of government, city/county ordinances. So this would be like the city of Tuscaloosa. Notice that we're kind of low on the totem pole here. Types of federal powers. You will need to know these for an activity that you're going to be doing at the very end, and you'll also need to know these for your test. Make sure you have these in your notes. First, we have enumerated, otherwise known as expressed powers. Now, when something is expressly written, that means it's directly written. There's no going against it. You can't argue against it. So, for example, in the Constitution, the federal government is the only one that has the power to declare war, coin money, etc. Implied powers, those are additional powers that are reasonably granted from the expressed powers. So, for example, if I were to say that the way you wrote it, it implies something, or you've heard some people say, well, you didn't say it like that, but you meant it this way. That means you're implying something. In the Constitution, the wording is written in a certain way that the government over the years have been able to grant themselves more power based on the wording. For example, the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause is what it's known as. Elastic is something that stretches, which means that the government can stretch its power to gain more power. And then finally you have inherent. Inherent powers are assumed powers given to a recognized sovereign state or national government. For example, the federal government are the only ones who are allowed to actually acquire territory. Alabama cannot just take over territory in South America, okay? The federal government is the only entity that can take over or acquire territory. All right, so we also have state powers. State powers are not listed in the Constitution, but they are given to the states through the 10th Amendment. And it says, all powers not expressly given to the national government, nor prohibited, are reserved for the states. So, why is that showing? Okay. So, first you have reserved powers, which are those strictly for the state. For example, the state governments are the only ones who are allowed to establish schools. The federal government does not have that power. So whenever you hear people talk about anything school related, the federal government can't touch it. Okay? Now, they can mandate money, and that's how they kind of get their way, which we'll talk about in this section, but they cannot establish schools and they cannot interfere, per se. They also, the states have the power to regulate interstate commerce. Next, we have concurrent powers, and concurrent is another word for overlapping. So powers that are shared by both the federal government and the state government. For example, you have federal laws and you have state laws. The federal government can establish crimes and punishments, and the states can also establish crimes and punishments. You can get the death penalty in Alabama. We don't, use it too much, but you can also be put to death at the federal level. Next, we have prohibited powers. So that means that neither the state nor the federal government can exercise these. And you have, for example, tax exports. So who settles conflicts? Between the 10th Amendment and the Necessary and Proper Clause, there's bound to be conflicts between the states, because there's always going to be this argument over, you don't have the right to do that, yes I do, and then it just goes back and forth. People usually favor states' rights or federal rights. So consider an issue like same-sex marriage. Originally, marriage and anything to do with that were up to the states. It used to be illegal for same-sex couples to be married in the United States. It says, should states be able to determine their own policies, or should the federal government step in to make a nationwide rule? Who decides these conflicts? Well, it is the Supreme Court. And this goes in your notes. Okay, so we said, why did the founders choose a system of federalism? They wanted to avoid tyranny, okay, and they also wanted to separate power. What is an example of an express power, a reserved power, and a concurrent power? Remember, we said that expressed is something that is expressly given. So the power to declare war, that is something that is only given to the federal government. Now, a reserved power is something that is given to the states. They're reserved for the states. So remember, we said that creating schools, those are reserved for the states. And concurrent powers. Can the federal government tax you? Yes, they can. Can the state government tax you? Yes, they can. Those are overlapping or concurrent powers. Key issues over time. So these are some of the issues that have come up over time with the issue of federalism. These are issues that the federal government and the states argue over all the time. Slavery and segregation was a major issue, okay? You've also have the drinking age, election regulations, same-sex marriage, abortion, legalization of marijuana, and education. So, next we discuss dual versus cooperative federalism. I don't think that I could put this in your notes, but we'll just cover it briefly. Dual federalism, we know what dual is, it's, together. Separate. It's late, guys. So, dual federalism is clear separation or an even tension. Powers of each level of government are more defined and narrow. It's also difficult to maintain. Now, cooperative means that you work together. This happened a lot during the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt. That created shared powers, shared cost, but it blurred the lines between the federal government and the state governments. It also allowed federal government more power and more control. A lot of people accused Franklin Roosevelt of being more of a socialist. Okay, so we'll talk more about that later. This is an example, and it's also in your notes, of dual federalism versus cooperative. So notice that on the dual federalism side, you've got that pretty cake. It looks great right now. And it's separated by layers. They do not intertwine. However, on the other side, cooperative federalism is a marble cake, and all the layers work together. It also kind of confuses you because you don't know where the power, or who has the power. So, we have the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause provides the federal government has the right to regulate interstate and foreign commerce/trade. It has been used to increase the power of national government over time, and it was made clear in the Supreme Court case Gibbons versus Ogden. And in this court case, the Supreme Court ruled that the power to regulate interstate commerce, in this case the waterways, is the exclusive power of the federal government, because the waterways are not owned by a particular state. So that is why they declared that the federal government had the power to regulate. Next, Commerce Clause limitations. The court has also stepped in to limit the federal government regarding commerce. Another word for commerce is trade. In the Supreme Court case U.S. versus Lopez, the Supreme Court struck down a federal law banning guns in school zones, which are not considered interstate commerce. And also, the Supreme Court case Prince versus U.S., the national government cannot force state governments to carry out a federal regulatory program. However, we'll get into mandates. So even though they can't make a state cooperate with a federal program, they can punish them in other ways. Regulations between the states. First, we have the full faith and credit clause. This means that states are required to honor the court proceedings, contracts, and acts of other state governments. For example, if I get a driver's license in Alabama and I travel to California or Nevada for a vacation, they are supposed to honor the fact that I have a legal driver's license. Now, if I were to move there permanently, I would have to eventually switch over my driver's license through to the state of California or Nevada, wherever I move, which means I'll probably have to take another driving test. But if you were just moving, going on vacation somewhere, they would have to honor the fact that you are legally allowed to drive. Extradition. This is another word for extradite. So, for example, let's say that you commit a crime in Alabama and you flee to Texas. Okay? The way this works is the states are supposed to honor court proceedings, things like that. So that means that if you commit a crime in Alabama, even though you have moved to Texas, Texas is supposed to send you back to Alabama to face trial. Another thing, same with marriages and divorces. States are supposed to honor marriage contracts and divorces across the states. Same thing with business contracts. We also have Privileges and Immunities Clause. This prevents states from depriving rights or privileges to citizens who reside in different states. For example, if you live in California, you are free to travel or move across state lines to Oregon or Nevada without special documentation. You don't have to have a passport to travel to a different state, nor do you have to have any kind of proof of, a birth certificate or something like that Typically, all you need is a driver's license as long as you're able to drive, but you also don't have to have that. The exceptions to this rule is in-state college tuition. You do have to make sure that you are a resident of other states for in-state college tuition. And same thing with state voting rights. If you move to another state, you have to honor their voting laws, which means that you have to be registered to vote in that area. If you are not, you have to sign up for a mail-in ballot, or you would have to travel home to vote on the election day. So, two clauses that have expanded the power of the federal government. We talked about the elastic clause, and we also talked about the supremacy clause. What policy states that if a fugitive flees from one state, the state captures the fugitive, he is bound to return him or her. We said that that is called extradition. Okay? So you need to make sure you remember these. Now, fiscal federalism, whenever you say the word fiscal, you're referring to money. So states rely heavily on the federal government for funding. Now, remember I told you that the states cannot, or the federal government cannot require that the states follow federal rules or federal laws, or make them follow certain things. However, they can take their money away. So, grants and aid. Federal grants are given to states or local governments to help pay for everyday expenses. Giving money is a way the federal government can control the state decisions or operation without violating the Constitution. Types of grants. First, we have categorical grants. Those are given for a specific purpose, and they often come with strings attached, such as matching. For example, money is given specifically for a state's free lunch program. For example, again, we'll talk about Bryant. Bryant is known as a Title I school, which means there are a reasonable amount of children in the area that are zoned to Bryant who do not have enough money to pay for lunches and breakfasts and things like that. So through this Title I program, the federal government provides food or provides money for breakfast and lunches. That's one of the reasons that we have to be so strict over what you bring into the school to eat for breakfast, because if we were to ever be audited by the federal government, we could lose that funding. Next, we have block grants. Those are given for a broader purpose. Broad means wide, okay? They have fewer restrictions. So, for example, money is given for the general field of education. Mandates. Mandates means that states must follow set terms given by the federal government, and they may give a penalty if they are not followed. And usually those are in the place of fines and things like that. For example, the Civil Rights Act, the states had to follow it, whether they liked it or not. No Child Left Behind, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. The federal government may give states an incentive or a penalty. So like I said, they may either receive money or they may have to pay money. Now, we're not going to discuss this one. Pros and cons of federalism. Pros. It prevents too much centralized power. It allows state individuality. It's practical considering the U.S. population, and it allows us to learn from state successes/failures. The cons of federalism. One of the cons of federalism is that you have confusion and lack of uniformity. For example, one state allows you to carry a concealed weapon while another's does not. You may unknowingly break the law. We'll talk about Alabama, for example. You can carry a concealed weapon as long as you have a permit in the state of Alabama. However, if you were to travel to New York, even if you had a gun that was taken apart in your checked bag on your flight, the checked bag is the one that goes in the back area of the plane. It doesn't sit up with you. Even if you have the pieces of the gun separated and you have a permit, you could still be thrown in jail or given a fine. They have very strict gun laws in New York. Lack of accountability. All states that have legalized marijuana are technically in violation of federal law, but nothing has really been done about it. Marijuana is considered a controlled substance in the eyes of the federal law, and it's on the same level as something like heroin. Okay. Now, whether you want to argue or not, It just means that they have not made a decision yet on how they want to pass that. There has been a bill on the House floor to legalize marijuana, but it hasn't really moved in a while because of everything else going on. When do we see issues of federalism today? So we see the legalization of marijuana. That's an issue because certain states are legalizing it. The federal government is going to have to eventually make a decision on whether they want to legalize it nationwide. You also see it on gun control / gun rights, LGBTQ plus rights, immigration or laws regarding undocumented immigrants. We have what is called the nickname sanctuary cities. Some of these more liberal cities, typically run by Democrats around the country, they will consider themselves a sanctuary city where they will take in illegal aliens or illegal citizens. I'm sorry, they're not citizens. Illegals, illegal immigrants. And what will happen is the federal government has passed laws in the past to say they're trying to crack down on this. You probably heard of ICE and things like that. But if a city starts to bring in undocumented immigrants and considers it a safe zone, they are technically violating federal law, and they can be fined, fiscally. So that means they'll have to pay certain amounts of money to the federal government for breaking the law. Education is another, and then finally minimum wage. And we know that that's been a big topic in the past, 5 years. All right. Check for understanding what type of grant is given to the states for a very specific purpose. Okay, for specific things, you think of categories or categorical grants. And what is one pro and one con of federalism? So a pro of federalism is the fact that the states are individualized. Alabama, I don't know a lot of people who want Alabama to become more like California. California's got a lot of problems, in my opinion. So does Alabama. But that's a big state. There's a lot of people there. Okay. And one con of federalism is the lack of uniformity. Okay. And this is one of the activities you will have to do. You're not working with a partner, obviously, but we'll stop here.